Hello, everybody. I'm Jamie Druckman. I'm the Associate Director of IPR. I want to welcome everybody to our biannual post-election panel, which we've been doing since at least 2004. And we're very happy to say that this is a post-election panel rather than a during election panel. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off today very, very briefly, just providing a little bit of context of the political situation going into the election. Most of it will be things that don't surprise anybody, but provide a little bit of the scenario. And then I'll turn it over to Dan Galvin, who will moderate the panel and introduce the panelists. And so coming into the election, one of the most notable dynamics in American politics was what's called the rise of negative partisanship. And this graph shows that dynamic and how that's been going on. So this is a prominent survey question that's been asked since 1948. Actually, the graph shows it since 1978. And it asks people from representative American voters to score parties on a scale from 0, very cold, to 100, very warm. So it's called a feeling thermometer. And what you see is a very clear monotonic trend, and that's the dotted line. And it shows that the score of the out parties, so the Republicans for Democrats or the Democrats for Republican, has declined dramatically over time, so that the average score right now is about at 25, and the modal score is actually at 0. So we've seen this dramatic rise in what's called negative partisanship, and sometimes goes under the moniker of affective polarization. This has had extreme consequences in some of the things that have gone on during the times of this election. For one, it has affected the reactions to COVID-19. And this is just a graph that shows Republican behaviors with regard to COVID-19 and preventive behaviors. And what it shows in short is that as affective partisan animosity increases, which is the bottom of the scale, the x-axis, the likelihood that a Republican would engage in preventive COVID behaviors declined. And so in other words, affective polarization was clearly affecting the reaction to COVID-19, and we could flip it for the Democrats and we'd see the opposite trend. And what's going on there is the impact of partisan elites and voters reacting based on their partisan animosity. It's also affected acceptance of democratic norms. And this is just another similar graph that shows those with low partisan animosity versus high partisan animosity, and the likelihood that they would endorse a series of different democratic norms. And we can see for Democrats, as they had more and more animosity towards Republicans, they were more likely to endorse democratic norms, and Republicans showed the opposite. So again, this change in this partisan atmosphere in which we live has clearly had consequences for COVID-19 and democratic norms, which has obviously been two of the things central on the agenda prior to the election and currently as we go through the transition. I do want to leave and turn it over on a more positive note. And this is a tweet that I'm sure many of you saw, which was pre-election on November 2nd from Trump. The Supreme Court decision on voting in Pennsylvania is a very dangerous one. It will allow rampant and unchecked cheating and will undermine our entire systems of laws. It will also induce violence in the streets. Something must be done. And it's obviously somewhat of an alarmist tweet. But I think what happened subsequently is worth emphasizing. One is there's not been mass violence. Two, vote counting by serious accounts has gone very well. Three, social media by most accounts did very well. You even see on this tweet, Twitter did flag that tweet as problematic. And participation was record setting. It looks like voting turnout is going to be at about 70%, which is really unprecedented. And so that's just a little bit of context going into our current times in the election. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to get much more acute insights. And so I'll let Dan Galvin, who's an associate professor of political science and an IPR fellow, will moderate what follows. And I want to really thank very much the panelists, Laurel Harbridge-Yong from political science, Erik Nisbet, who's just joined Northwestern, who's the Owen Kuhn Endowed Professor of Policy Analysis and Communication in the School of Communication and an IPR associate, Marty Eichenbaum, who's a Charles Moscow's Professor of Economics and an IPR associate, and Chloe Thurston, who's in political science and an IPR fellow. So thank you all again to the panelists and to Dan for taking your time to share your thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Jamie, and welcome everyone. So as you might have heard, Joe Biden has defeated Donald Trump and is now president-elect. He flipped the 3 blue wall states and is likely to win 2 more in Arizona and Georgia, with North Carolina likely to remain in Trump's column. So when the dust settles, Biden will probably end up with 306 electoral votes, which oddly enough is exactly the same number of electoral votes that Donald Trump won in 2016, just with different states. As of this morning, Biden was 3 percentage points and more than 4 million votes ahead of Trump in the popular vote, and experts are predicting a 7 million vote differential once all the votes are counted. The incumbent has filed lawsuits to contest the validity of the election in several states, but few serious people think they will be successful or sufficient to alter the election results. I wanted to note that it's pretty unusual for an incumbent president to lose re-election, especially when the president's party has only served one term in the White House. Trump is only the second such president to be defeated in the last 128 years, sharing this inglorious distinction with Jimmy Carter. Although the election seemed to offer repudiation of Trump, down ballot elections tell a different story. So in the Senate, Democrats netted only one seat so far with 4 outstanding races as of this morning. Republicans are expected to hold their seats in Alaska and North Carolina, which means majority control of the Senate will probably be determined by the 2 runoffs in Georgia on January 5th. In the House, Democrats are expected to maintain control, but Republicans netted 5 seats with 24 races still undeclared. At the state level, the story is basically virtually no change. Only 2 state legislative chambers flipped partisan control, and 2 chambers are still outstanding. Including governors, Republicans gained trifectas in New Hampshire and Montana, and will have unified party control in a total of 22 states. Democrats will have unified control in 15 states, and 11 will be divided. 2 are still counting. So this will have major implications for the redistricting process next year, which is run by state legislatures and which will shape the balance of power in the House for the next decade. Early exit poll data is not very reliable, but when combined with county level election returns, there do appear to be a few surprises, including Trump gaining support among Latinx voters and perhaps a few points among Black voters as well. And he's doing better among high income voters as compared to 2016. There's still a lot to unpack about this election, including its implications for governance in a still polarized nation that continues to fight a deadly pandemic. Major question marks hang over the shape and direction of future public policy, as well as how the nation will deal with looming financial pressures. So we have a terrific panel of experts to discuss these and other issues today. In the interest of time, I'll introduce them only very briefly in the order in which they'll speak. So first we have Laurel Harbridge-Yong, who is an associate professor of political science and IPR faculty fellow here at Northwestern. She's an expert on the United States Congress, political parties, public opinion. She's the author of 2 groundbreaking books on legislative politics, including Is Bipartisanship Dead, published in 2015, and Rejecting Compromise, published this year. Erik Nisbet is Owen L. Kuhn Endowed Professor of Policy Analysis and Communication and Director of the Center for Communication and Public Policy in the School of Communication here at Northwestern. His research lies at the intersection of communication, public opinion, and public policy in areas including science, technology, and environmental policy, governance and elections, and international security. We have Marty Eichenbaum, who's the Charles Moscos Professor of Economics and the co-director of the Center for International Macroeconomics here at Northwestern. His research focuses on macroeconomics, international economics, the monetary theory and policy. He's an expert on aggregate economic fluctuations, the causes and consequences of exchange rate fluctuations, and the effect of monetary policy on business cycles. And last but not least is Chloe Thurston, who's an assistant professor of political science and an IPR faculty fellow here at Northwestern. She's an expert on American political development and American political economy, interest groups, and social movements. And she's the author of the award-winning book, At the Boundaries of Homeownership, on the politics of homeownership and access to credit in America. So each presenter will speak for a few minutes, and then we'll shift into Q&A. At any time, please use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, the Q&A button, to ask questions. I will then read your questions aloud and solicit responses from the panelists. Please do include your affiliation so I can properly announce you, and also who you're addressing your question to. We will end promptly at 1:15 today. So Laurel Harbridge-Yong, let's start with you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this today. So I want to start off where Jamie kind of left off in terms of mentioning that polarization in the public can be based either on kind of issue positions that people have or on what he talked about in terms of this negative polarization or affective partisanship. And we can think about similar types of polarization in Congress as well, or among our elected officials more broadly. So among Congress and our elected officials, we've seen stark rises in polarization over the last 70 years. So when we think about the US Congress, there used to be significant overlap between the positions of Democrats and Republicans in Congress. But this isn't the case anymore. There also used to be many more moderates, those who took positions that were a bit more at odds with their party and much more towards the center. Today, there's no overlap and very few moderates at all. Yet in Congress, just like the public, partisan conflict extends beyond ideology. Legislators in a party have a collective interest in winning and in being in the majority party. And this competition, particularly since the 1980s and exacerbated even more over the last few decades, has increased the extent of partisan conflict, even on non-ideological issues. So competition between the parties for majority control encourages the majority party to pursue what gets called messaging bills. So bills that convey positions to their base or to interest groups, but have no chance at passage, and the leadership knows this when they bring up the bill. So for instance, when the House Republicans brought up 70 plus votes to repeal the Affordable Care Act, when the Senate was controlled by Democrats and Obama was in the White House, this would be a messaging bill with no real chance at passage. So this competition between the two parties for control also encourages members of the minority party to vote against bills sponsored by the majority, regardless of their content. And moreover, when we know that when the president takes a position on legislation, this makes party conflict even more likely. So when we think about kind of the election outcomes and what we might expect going forward, so as Dan alluded to, Democrats did not do as well as polls had expected them to do in either presidential, House, Senate, or state legislative races. There's some evidence that people did split ballots, voting for Biden, but supporting Republicans lower on the ballot. I don't think we have strong evidence yet as to whether these were actually Republicans who crossed over to support Biden or if these were just independents. But in terms of the outcomes in Congress, right now, the most likely outcome, pending the few remaining races, is that the House stays in Democratic hands, but with a very narrow majority, and that the Senate is in Republican control, but again, with a narrow majority. This would be no change from the current congressional arrangements in terms of who is the majority party. So there are two different things that I want to talk about briefly in terms of the implications of the election for policymaking and partisanship. So first, should we expect Congress to focus on bipartisan or only highly partisan legislation? So in research for my first book, I argued that party leaders want to pursue legislation that aligns with their ideological platform and that points out differences between the majority and the minority party. That is, they care both about ideology, but also about power. And this would suggest that they would want to pursue as partisan of an agenda as is possible. So if there are two different policy options on healthcare, Democrats would prefer them to advance the more liberal one to a more bipartisan compromise. But there are several constraints on this highly partisan agenda. So first, the heterogeneity of their caucus matters. If there are many members who represent constituents that are not well aligned with their party, these members will not support the more partisan agenda of their leadership. In general, districts today are very well sorted by party. But the Democrats' win and kind of their regaining of majority control in the 2018 elections in the House came by picking up many Republican-leaning suburbs. So there may be a limit on how far left these members like Sean Casten or others would be willing to go in terms of supporting an agenda. And this constraint is all the more important when there's a small majority. The Democratic majority in the House will need every Democratic vote in the chamber to pass legislation. And so a second constraint then is the need to produce a record of legislative success. So if there's divided government or when you have a small majority, there may be constraints that force the party leadership to bring forward more bipartisan legislation than they would if they had unified government or very large majorities. So more broadly then, we can think back to what I mentioned earlier about a messaging legislation, and that there are trade-offs between legislating or governing and messaging. Bipartisan legislation or compromises might be good for governing, but they're bad for messaging. They demoralize fellow partisans or the base. They don't make your aligned interest groups happy. And we also know that there's greater incentives for messaging when there's heightened competition for majority control. As we saw in this election, and as we anticipate the parties looking forward to 2022, both parties see the majority status of both chambers in play. And so this will only heighten their desires to kind of fight with each other, pursue messaging bills, and vote against the efforts of the opposing party. We also know that messaging is most likely when there's a divided Congress. So as we've had the last 2 years, and as we likely will have the next 2 years, when the House and Senate are controlled by opposite parties, there is a greater likelihood of this messaging behavior because accountability is lower and it's easier for each side to blame the opposing side. Ultimately, I suspect that there may be more room for bipartisan agreement on things that are viewed as kind of essential governing activities, both your regular kind of budgeting and behaviors there, but also some degree of economic response to the pandemic, but expecting much greater partisanship around key party priorities like healthcare. So the last thing that I want to talk about then is how might the primary elections that occurred in Congress this year matter going forward? So this year, numerous candidates lined up as primary challengers to long-serving incumbents, arguing that the incumbents were too moderate for the district. And in the end, 5 of these ideological challenges were successful. So in the Democratic primaries, William Lacey Clay in Missouri, Daniel Lipinski in Illinois, and Elliot Engel in New York all lost to more progressive challengers. And on the Republican side, Denver Riggleman from Virginia and Scott Tipton from Colorado lost to conservative challengers. So even though few legislators lose, in my recent research, we've argued that primary elections have important consequences. And so we argue that legislators fear that primary voters will punish them if they compromise on legislation, and that this fear and perception of punishment leads them to reject compromise proposals that give them part, but not all of what they want. And this is particularly striking given that majorities of the public routinely express support for compromise in surveys. So legislators are acting out of their perception of what primary voters want, even when this is not what the majority of the public would like. And so even though relatively few members lose in their primary elections, when members see this happening to their colleagues, even if it's only a few of them, we saw it with the Tea Party wave in 2010 and 2012, and then beginning more on the Democratic side in the last few election cycles. This reinforces the view among members that if they compromise, if they work across the aisle, that they too might lose in the primary election. And so these primary losses, even though they're relatively few, run the risk of encouraging legislators to stick to their positions, hold out for the whole loaf, and to reject compromise. With that, I'll pass it off to our next panelist.
Okay, thank you, Laurel. Next up, we have Erik Nisbet from the School of Communication.
Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for having me participate in this panel today. So I'm going to share my slides. Hopefully you can see this. So I want to briefly talk about some perspectives on misinformation in the 2020 campaign. I want to start a little bit about thinking about 2016, where for many, the presumed influence of misinformation in 2016 caught many academics and policymakers almost unawares, even though misinformation, especially internationally in elections, had been a known phenomenon and impactful and been studied for some time. I think since 2016, there's been a wealth of academic studies looking at the role of misinformation, political misinformation in elections and in our body politic and political discourse more broadly. And I think we have a much better understanding since then of how it spreads online, who may or may not be exposed to it, what audiences may or may be more vulnerable in terms of demographics or psychodemographics. We have a better understanding. We had some understanding, and we even have a better understanding now of what are the psychological factors that drive belief and endorsement in misinformation and some of the social influences on people's adoption or belief in misinformation. And we have a wealth of studies now looking at fact-checking, and both in academically as well as Jamie mentioned in practice, where you have social media platforms now engaging in more proactive fact-checking of potential misinformation, flagging content. And we have a better understanding of some of its strengths, that it does work, but also some of its limitations, that even when we discount or flag potential misinformation, it might continue to have influence on people's beliefs or behaviors for a variety of reasons. So we have a better understanding in these cases. But there's always a say about how, we always sort of fight or prepare for the last war, not the current war. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how misinformation might be manifesting in 2020 and some of the questions that myself and other scholars are taking a look at and will be continue to look at as we move past the post-election phase. First of all, voting. One of the big questions that people have is, does misinformation actually impact people's vote choice? There is still an ongoing debate. Some scholars argue quite strongly that no, that it does not. That is merely a manifestation of ideology or favorability, pre-existing beliefs and attitudes about candidates, and that in itself is not persuasive, especially since we know that often it's a limited scale and audience that might be exposed to it. I think the evidence is a little more mixed. There's no evidence discounting that, disconfirming that misinformation might impact vote choice, just as we still do not have solid evidence that it does. There's been some studies, both in the United States and internationally. Internationally, how much do they apply to the United States is questionable. In the United States, there weren't a lot of designs already in place to track its influence for 2016. So the evidence that we do have often has some methodological weaknesses, either for or against whether it has an impact on vote choice. So I think we'll have a better understanding coming out of 2020 because academics and others were better prepared, had designs in place to try to ascertain whether it influences people's voting behavior. I will also say that when we think about the impact of information and media on voting, I think we also have to realize that the impact might be broader than simply persuasion. We go back to the classic voting studies now, 60 years old from the early 1940s, where actually often information and media might have an activating or mobilizing impact, simply not persuasion into itself. So when you think about misinformation's impact on voting, I think we need to also have a broader understanding of its impact. It's not simply persuasion, it can be also reinforcement or mobilization of one's own side. And that lines up with the huge amount of turnout we've seen on both the left and the right in this election. Not only was there a blue wave, there was also a substantial red wave in turnout this year. The other thing, though, I think that we need to think about misinformation's impact is it might have an indirect impact. What we mean by this is the so-called third person effect. The third person effect is the idea is that you don't believe media or information or some type of content impacts oneself that much, but you overestimate how much it impacts others, right? And so there's an emergent body of research, and one of the studies we have in the field now is looking at the presumed influence of misinformation. And this is driven, if you look at Pew survey studies leading up to the election, about a half of Americans believe that misinformation is a very big problem in general. And moreover, 2/3 of the respondents to Pew surveys reported that misinformation had a major impact on Americans' confidence in government and creates a great deal of confusion. So, 2/3 of Americans believe that misinformation has impacts on others. Why is this important? Why we think that misinformation might not impact ourselves, but impacts other people? Well, it has the potential to harm our confidence in the electoral system itself. Part of democracy is having confidence and believing that the procedures by which we choose our elected leaders are fair and free. If people believe that misinformation is tainting or impacting these procedures, for better or worse, it might actually reduce their confidence in the actual outcome or results, the perceived legitimacy of the winner, and more broadly speaking, their satisfaction with democracy itself and democratic practices. So this is something that we're concerned about and exploring in the context of 2020. The third, so that's voting and third person effects. The third thing we're looking at is this idea of informational learned helplessness. Myself and IPR fellow Olga Kamenchak, also in the School of Communication, and we're looking at whether being exposed and having to increase to misinformation and the increased cognitive cost that comes with trying to figure out what's true or false might actually have a debilitating effect on people's motivation and willingness to try to continue to accept, to figure out and discern true from false information. So as the cognitive costs, emotional costs increase of trying to figure out what is true and what is not, people might just willing to give up and feel sort of helpless. And that might have some impact on their willingness to accept false information in general. These are things we're looking at, but what I wanted to sort of stress or emphasize are these two last points that we are continuing to do post-election, and I think are also important. I think if you look at, as Jamie said, that social media, fake news prior to the election, misinformation was not as big a problem as we thought. The Hunter Biden story, for example, that was published in New York Post, though it got over 1 million Facebook engagements, right? Even though Twitter and Facebook tried to limit, it spread. It and like stories got a great deal of social media engagement. It never really took off as an overall sort of narrative about the Hunter Biden emails and the laptop. And we didn't really see any particular widespread huge narrative that actually jumped from sort of right-leaning outlets to the mainstream. But now in the post-election, as we see Trump and Republicans refusing to concede based upon Joe Biden being the projected winner, we might actually see additional misinformation actually be more important post-election than pre-election, especially might impact people's perceptions about the legitimacy and fairness and of the actual election. It's something that we are going to be tracking, continue to track. The other thing, the last item I want to leave on is the idea of partisan violence, or the willingness to tolerate partisan violence. This is something we were also been tracking on a study right now in the field, both pre and post-election. And I think misinformation, the question of how misinformation might amplify people's perceptions that partisan violence post-election is justified, whether it's on the left or the right, may be something that we want to take stock of. There are other scholars been looking at this. In some of our results, we have about 20% of our sample believes that partisan violence, electoral violence prior to the election was at least justified to some degree. And so the question is post-election, especially as we see more misinformation possibly about the legitimacy of the election or election fraud, whether we see changes among either Democrats or Republicans in their attitudes and perceptions about whether violence is justified in light of who won the election. So these are some factors that I think I'd be happy to discuss about that, when we think about 2020 and the role of misinformation, that we need to be sensitive about. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Erik, so much. Next up is Marty Eichenbaum.
Thank you very much. Trying to get to the slides here. All right, it's telling me there we go. All right. Great. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this panel. It's always a pleasure. So the title of my comments are Blue Waves, Purple Puddles, and the Post-Election Economy. So I think the blue wave actually was a purple puddle. And there's sort of two ways to maybe think about that as background for my comments about the economy. The positive spin is that Americans don't like Donald Trump as a person, but they're pretty much okay with his economic policies. And they don't want drastic changes in our basic frame of the way the economy works. The negative spin is that Americans are just equally split between competing visions of the role of how the government should impact on our daily lives. Either way you look at it, it's really difficult to interpret the election as having provided us with a there's just no mandate, and I will add no money for major new social programs. That is not to say that the president can't do a variety of important things in terms of executive actions, which I'm sure he will. But the first, second, and third priorities of the new administration will have to be dealing with the economic consequences of COVID and its aftermath. There's just a hard, grinding reality of the numbers that will constrain the actions of whoever is in power. Brief background, if you think about the extraordinary responses of the Federal Reserve and the government as a whole to the COVID crisis, they're really premised on two key assumptions. The first, and thank God there was terrific news today from Pfizer, the assumption was that a medical solution to the pandemic would arrive within a year or two. Secondly, the other assumption was that there were no gross pre-pandemic economic imbalances that needed to be corrected, unlike, say, 2008. So if you buy into those two assumptions, the implication was that policy should be geared at minimizing the long-term economic damage from the health crisis. What that's meant as a practical matter, and I'll show you some data on this, is an unprecedented rise in the ratio of federal debt to GDP, an unprecedented shortfall in state revenues. I'll have some data about that. And at least at the federal level, it was financed by debt through, in part, unprecedented actions by the Federal Reserve. So what's the long-term damage to the economy? Well, obviously in the real world actual, if I just, snap my fingers and told you that we could somehow have a magic pill that we all took, you might think, well, gee, we'd kind of go back to where we were, roughly speaking, last January. But of course, in the real world, actual recessions can create what I will refer to as inefficient job losses. And there are lots of examples of that. Firms could be really good firms, except for this horrible state of the world where they, have fixed costs, but they're pretty productive and they just have to muddle through. But we're going to destroy those firms because of the debt and revenue shortfalls. That's one obvious example. But people, just as importantly, when they lose their jobs, they become disengaged from the workforce and eventually lose skills, networking ability, etc. So there's a popular phrase that a lot of policymakers talk about, which is building a bridge over the COVID crisis, right? And that's difficult and will vary from country to country because you have to balance inefficient job losses, but there is some sectoral reallocation that's going on. I don't know exactly how we're going to teach in the future. It'll involve some Zoom. I don't know exactly how much travel there will be, but we do need to allocate resources from old uses to new uses. But there's a balance to be paid there, and no one wants to go to an extreme. Any way you think about it, building a bridge costs a lot of money, a lot of money. How much? Well, first, just to put in the back of your head, GDP, the value of what we produce in about a year is about $20.5 trillion. The CARES Act was 2.2 trillion, was by far the largest economic stimulus package in US history. It dwarfed the Obama package, which was about 800 million. What I've got here is Congressional Budget Office's baseline in September, what they thought, what they think now the deficit will be and what they used to think it was. And what you want to see from this graph is in March, they thought we'd be at 4% deficit of GDP. Lots of people were freaking out. Not everybody. Some people think there's that we could manage that. But this is an indication of where we were. It was 16% of GDP at the worst. And those are big numbers. What does that mean in terms of debt? So this is a graph of federal debt generated, this comes from CBO. And what was debt as a percent of our GDP? What you can see here is World War II was an unprecedentedly, I'm not sure that's English, an incredibly high percentage of debt to GDP. We are at about that now. So if nothing else changed, right, we would owe more as a percent of GDP than we did after World War II. To see quite how scary that is, depending on, a graph like this has a lot of assumptions in it. Of course, when you see, these numbers going to 200%, it depends, for example, on population growth rates, which we can predict pretty well. It depends on the growth rate of productivity, which has been slowing down for many years. And there's some confidence in that. More iffy is what will interest rates be? Because when you have a debt that big, when interest rates go up, you start eating enormous amounts of your current tax base just paying off the debt. So if you bought the Congressional Budget Office benchmark projection by 2050, just paying interest would consume 8% of GDP and an enormous percent of what the government spends in terms of its actual expenses. So those are not small numbers. If interest rates turned out to be smaller than those projections, the problem will be somewhat bigger. But anyway you cut it, starting from a base of where we are now, debt to GDP is going to be really, really big. It's much worse when you take the states into account, and this I basically cut and paste from the Wall Street Journal, and this actually comes from a serious study. And you ask, how are the states doing? Well, it won't surprise you to know that the states are doing terribly. Illinois, always in the lead, starts off from a horrible base and will just have enormous budget shortfalls. And they can't borrow, unlike the federal government. They really, to a first order approximation, cannot borrow. So what they have to do is cut or raise taxes. Take your pick. It's not a particularly good idea to raise taxes in the middle of a recession. So the states make the problem much worse. I'll just be very brief about the Fed, which is we really entered into uncharted territory of what the Fed did, and history will treat this Fed very well for having prevented a health crisis from becoming a financial crisis, but there was a cost. The balance sheet of the Fed went from $4 trillion, that's the value of their assets, to $7 trillion. Those are very, very big numbers. How did they do that? Well, Jay Powell hit the tab key basically and printed money to pay for those things. I'm not particularly panicked about that. Another talk, we could talk about that. But the Fed bought over $2 trillion of the Treasury debt the Treasury was issuing to pay for the CARES Act, to pay for the federal tax revenue shortfall, et cetera. So one way to think about that is that the Fed used to hold about 10% of all Treasury debt outstanding. Today it holds more than 20%, and that's climbing as we speak. Where are we now? Well, you can see from this very dramatic graph, this is the unemployment rate. There are many statistics I could give you from the labor market. We went from a number around 3%, 3.5%. And by the way, this is a big deal in terms of how people felt about the two parties in terms of the economy. It's not that long ago, they remember this 3.5%. It jumped to an insane number of well in excess of 15%. We're now at about 6.9, which feels kind of better, but it still means that it's incredibly high, not the peak of the financial crisis, but a socially enormously significant number. And the job market recovery is slowing down. Forecasting into the future, because it matters. If we grow quickly, we can solve this debt to GDP number, right? Just by growing. But that's unlikely. If you look at, say, the IMF, what's their forecast? 2020 GDP will fall by 4%. That's almost double the fall. That's a big fall. So even with a recovery, this is a much bigger hit to the economy than the financial crisis. For 2021, we're kind of guessing because a lot depends on health. But 3%, which means that we won't be back to where we started in terms of levels by the end of 2021. And thereafter, if you go into 2025 and you start to look at fundamentals like productivity growth rate, population growth rate, real GDP, large consensus will be growing at 1.8% per year, which is far below its, let's say, pre-financial crisis growth rate of something closer to 2.6. Those numbers matter. A difference between 1.8 and 2.6 in terms of debt GDP really, really matters. So with all of that as background, what will the new administration focus on? They got to pay for the bridge. That's it. If we get a new COVID package, and I don't know how big it'll be, it depends on the deal that Mitch McConnell and the Democrats reach. But suppose that's $2 trillion. That's what, roughly speaking, what the Democrats want, and it could be worth it. I'm not taking a stand on that. Add that 2 trillion to the debt numbers that we have now. These are really, really big numbers. So you put that all together, you have a slow recovery, massive federal debt, state revenue shortfalls, and a divided government. Whether one approves of this or not, it seems to me there's simply no chance of large new social initiatives. There will be a modest rise in taxes because with a divided government, we're not going to have a drastic fall in taxes, certainly, nor will we have a large rise in taxes. Although you can imagine they could agree on something like the corporate tax rate going from 21 to 28%, which would take us pre-Trump. That just doesn't leave any room left for large social programs. So the bottom line is, I won't go through these slides because I know I'm running short on time. I really do think realistically, the hard, brutal reality of the numbers is that the new administration will have to focus on extending that bridge, depending on just how good the news is on the vaccine, and then they got to pay for it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Marty. And if anyone thought after this weekend our blood pressure was going to be a little bit lower after the election was kind of settled, Marty Eichenbaum comes and throws a bucket of ice cold water over our heads. Thank you very much.
Very kind.
So next up, we have Chloe Thurston.
Hi, well, thanks everyone for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. And what I'm going to do today is discuss a bit about the role of social movements and organizing in the 2020 election, and their sort of potential influence on both the politics of the election itself and also the sort of policy proposals that came out of it. And then the challenges and opportunities provided by what appears right now to be the sort of likely political context coming this January 2021. And since we have a better idea now than we did on Friday when we practiced this, I'm going to focus my attention on social movements that were emerging from the left. And so just to begin, it's significant that in the middle of the summer, in the midst of these campaigns, there was a massive resurgence in Black Lives Matter protesting across the country. As Jamie's own survey research has found, about 5% of adult respondents interviewed in July reported they had participated in protests against racism and police violence. And these are national in scope. Even places that had low participation still had a lot, if you consider 2% of adults participating a lot, which many of us would. And again, this is also in the middle of a pandemic. So this isn't new in some sense, the scale might be, but social movements, protest movements, grassroots advocacy, and mobilizing have a long history in American politics, including in electoral politics and partisan politics. We can think about the Tea Party, the evangelical movement, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, all is having some of these dimensions. They're not formally part of the government or political parties or elections, but it doesn't mean that organizations and movements don't try to influence these things. For example, through selecting candidates at the primary stage or in trying to shape the content of party platforms. For the individual politician, organizations and movements can also work to shift the calculus of voting on certain issues or position taking on certain issues, as some of my own work on abortion position taking with the rise of different social movements has shown. Groups and movements can also entice parties and candidates with new resources, bringing in enthusiastic voters, assisting with different forms of grassroots organizing and support. Just as an example, in this election, BLM hosted drive-in rallies, text banking initiatives, and also ran their own ads to increase turnout. And more formally, BLM launched a PAC to support candidates, campaigns, and legislation. So there are also, at the same time, political scientists have described the risks for both parties and movements of too close of a linkage. For parties, there's a risk of associating closely with a movement because they don't have a lot of control over events or messaging. And this can create sort of conflicts and cleavages in a coalition. For movements, the risk is that their goals can get diluted as their positions are incorporated into mainstream politics. So there's always this incentive to sort of hold these things at an arm's length, even while trying to draw from the benefits that they can provide for each other. So I wanted to talk a bit about how a few social movements have influenced some policy priorities in this election. I'll give just two examples to save time, but there's some indication in the 2020 elections that movements and organizations helped to sort of reshape and reorient policy priorities. The first is the role of the Sunrise Movement. This was a movement of young climate activists, many of them under 30, claims about 10,000 organizers, and was previously known for playing an important role in the Green New Deal and sort of forming the contours of that proposal. So during the primaries, the Sunrise Movement gave Biden an F for his climate policy. After the primaries, as part of the process of reconciling the diverging wings of his party, the Sunrise folks of the Democratic Party, rather, the Sunrise folks helped to shape Biden's climate plan. And so it lacked the sort of ambition of the Green New Deal as they saw it, but contained a combination of rolling back executive actions during the Trump administration, spearheading important legislation. The centerpiece was to spend about $2 trillion, as I think Marty has already burst the bubble on, promoting clean energy. Second, in Black Lives Matter, renewed attention to racial justice issues in both policing and also in the economy more broadly. The DNC and the Biden-Harris campaign tried to disassociate from some of the more controversial measures, including sort of the call to defund the police, but while also signaling a commitment to recognizing the existence of and working to end systemic racism. The policy proposals of the Biden-Harris campaign included some recognition of some of the demands or sort of aims of the movement without moving fully to incorporate all of them. And so some that were included, though, were some forms of sentencing reform, high bias training, some limits on the transfer of military-grade equipment to local police, and some monitoring and accountability. Beyond policing, though, there was also an effort to tie the economic recovery to reducing racial economic disparities. And so here, for example, you see another movement, that of debt forgiveness linked to BLM through the issue of student loan debt, which has been another source of mobilization and advocacy, both in BLM, but also among student debt organizations like Strike Debt. So voters say that BLM was a factor in their decision. About 20% listed it as the protests as the single most important factor in their vote. Of course, all sorts of figures right now are preliminary. And about 90% of voters said that the protests were a factor in their voting, whether it sort of led them, regardless of what direction it led them to vote. So this leads to a question, though, that I want to spend the rest of my time on, and that is how can these groups with intense and also controversial at times policy preferences, and who might have also lent electoral support in terms of helping to turn out or interest younger voters, see their preferences become policy. And so I've titled this "What to Expect When You're Expecting a Divided Government." And there are many different constraints that I think are already quite predictable. And so first, and Laurel's talked a bit about this too, divided government, the sort of likelihood, one, the sort of very slim majority in the House for Democrats, but also the likelihood of a divided government when the outcome of the Senate is finally resolved, is going to take a lot of legislative action off of the table, particularly when it involves raising taxes, but for many of the reasons that Laurel has pointed to in terms of the few incentives for compromise in this context, it takes many issues off. Second, there may be more immediate issues, including pandemic and the sort of economic fallout thereof, that lead to competition for issue attention, especially in the sort of early period of transition. Third is that within the party, there are questions of how unified elected officials can be now that there's the issue of reconciling the policy demands of activists and social movement actors with elected officials' concerns about re-election. And of course, re-elections for members of the House are only 2 years away. Finally, in terms of the constraints that have to do with the venue of government action. And so particularly for issues involving police reform, while the protests drew national attention, the federal government's not the only, or in some cases, even the main actor that is responsible for wielding authority. So there are questions about sort of how limited the tools might be. A few opportunities or sort of expectations given those constraints. First is a continued emphasis on tools that don't require Congress. Unilateral action through the executive, as we've seen in domestic policy for the current and previous presidential administrations as well. For example, it is possible to forgive student loan debt or to sort of through executive orders in some limited sense, and this might be something that's discussed. Department of Justice guidelines can change and be sort of reoriented towards police oversight. And also a number of positions in the climate plan could be done through executive action, although the sort of legislative ones might be less likely. So for example, a Biden administration could rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement or impose fuel economy standards again. There is maybe limited possibility for a common ground with Republicans in Congress, given a divided government in a few different areas, including some parts of some climate policy experts see some common ground on things like clean energy standards for vehicles or carbon capture, but this is has to be looked at alongside some of the very real incentives that Laurel has pointed to. The final thing to mention is that I definitely wouldn't expect an end to advocacy and activism on these issues or others, even if public attention waxes and wanes, right? Public attention was very high before the election, over the summer for BLM. Organizers, however, are not naive about these different kinds of constraints and are generally pretty skeptical about the power of elections and the challenges of reform through sort of the electoral process and through existing institutions. At the same time, they will face their own constraints moving forward with respect to public attention, the resources they have at their disposal, and their ability to secure funding. So thank you.